Hey 302, I'm Jackie Ferris. On this week's show, we're at the Biggs Museum of American Art, and we're talking about plein air, aka painting outdoors. We're going to tell you all about the history behind going outside into Mother Nature and capturing her essence. So grab a paintbrush. The 302 is giving you plenty of canvas. Hey there, who would have thought painting outside was such a big deal? But when people started doing it, it certainly was revolutionary. We are here at the Biggs Museum of American Art. We're talking with Ryan Grover about the plein air movement. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So exactly what is plein air?
Plein air is it's a French term that just basically means outdoors. But when we talk about it in terms of painting, it means that the artists were leaving their studios and they were deliberately trying to find their inspiration and their subject matter directly from nature, outdoors, in front of the subjects that they wanted to paint.
So that was a big departure because when, people began the craft of painting, they were tied to the studio. Can you talk a little bit about why that was?
Well, so in sort of academic circles for painters, so like in colleges and universities or even in sort of apprentices to master painters, the idea of plein air painting wasn't necessarily a new thing. People had been studying from nature and using those studies to create what they might call sort of finished artworks for hundreds of years. This is the process, the concept was not necessarily new. It's the value that the artist and the collector and the museums and the public put into those studies, into those things that were done outside. Instead of just thinking them as sort of simple notations, we as a people developed a greater interest and appreciation of those studies. And then consequently, the studies became something new and interesting and kind of revolutionary.
So the majority of artists you talk about, they would be studying in schools and things. They would go out and they would make sketches and then they'd take them back to the studio, right?
Exactly. And they were trained to use those studies, but to also really heavily rely on their own imagination to create those finished artworks that they might share with a patron, or they might share with a big exposition or some other kind of large-scale sort of competition. But the things that they shared publicly were typically these very large, very finished paintings. But that didn't always have to be that way. And so a lot of artists sort of went in an opposite direction and said, we really value this time that we're in nature. We really value this sort of quick gestural application of paint that sort of hits and records these sort of climatic conditions on our subjects just for a couple of hours. And that's enough. That kind of technique, that kind of process, that fast application of paint, that by itself can be enough to be a finished painting. And it became sort of an interesting dilemma for artists. A lot of artists have put so much time and attention into creating these very finished, very polished, very what's the word I'm looking for? Very illusionistic kinds of paintings. And then other paintings said, no, it's really all about my gesture. It's all about what I'm doing to the subject. It's all about what I'm putting down on this canvas, the colors that I'm choosing. And so all of a sudden the artists themselves and the things that they do on those canvases become really important.
So one of the things that really was revolutionary and really helped this was the paint itself. In the beginning, all the paint was made in the studio, so you were kind of confined, but then paint started coming in tubes. Can you talk about how that was just, liberating for artists?
Truly, and liberating for a couple of different reasons, and that you hit on all of them, really. It's just this sort of this industrialization of the paint process. So painters up to that point had to, or their assistants would have to hand grind those minerals, those materials into a paste that they could then and then that paste could potentially travel to destinations. So really labor intensive, and a lot of these hand ground materials dry very quickly. So if you are able to industrially produce a chemically sound paint format in a tube, then you are able to travel with that tube. The tube then becomes sort of an airtight seal for those materials, and it doesn't dry very quickly. And you don't have to worry about sort of mixing it up or sort of making it viable right on the spot, you know, underneath the glaring sun or next to a river or something like that. So yeah, these ideas sort of traveling paints, and the chemical processes that were introduced in the 1800s to create these paints were also, they also created paint colors that were really vibrant, really bright. And so they changed the palette of painting for a lot of artists throughout that 1800s and into the 1900s.
I guess because before, I mean, there was color,
Sure.
but it was like dark, you know, there were some reds, greens, that kind of thing. But as you move into plein air and you have those bright colors, it's a whole new canvas and a whole new way of doing things.
If you go to the paint stores today, I mean, you can go to AC Moore and you can see these beautiful arrays of just, you know, paints in tubes. It's very much like what we're talking about from 150 years ago as well. But those bright colors, those huge, those super bright Kelly greens and those really, really intense blues and those bright sort of acidic yellows, those didn't really exist before synthetic colors were created during the Industrial Revolution. And so they really created or allowed artists to create compositions and sort of and imbue them with a color that becomes a subject within itself. So now you're not necessarily just looking at a haystack, you're looking at a haystack of this vibrant, intense color, and people sort of, they've recognized that they started to have an emotional content to that color, sort of an emotional connection to that color, which was really, really fun.
Now, the brighter colors in the tubes, did that have an impact on people that were staying in the studio? I mean, was it vivid colors? Was it something that was seen across the board after the creation of all these colors in tubes? Or?
So as plein air painters started to ascend in popularity, we started to see greater and greater numbers of people that started to practice that kind of art form, but and there is a tension that starts to exist. And a lot of those artists, especially artists, plein air artists that then sort of develop into Impressionism and sort of later plein air sort of painting techniques, the Impressionists were not instantly popular. I mean, we see sort of in the museums today, they're wildly popular and people love to see these shows. But when they first started coming out in like the 1870s, 1880s, people really didn't know what to do with them. They just thought, what are we, this looks like a jumbled mess on a canvas. We don't really understand this. It took a long while for that to really become important.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the Impressionists and just the act of getting out there and painting when we return.
Hi, my name is Kathy Parado, and I'm the Public Engagement Manager at the Delaware Museum of Natural History, and I love the creatures that we get to meet on the 302.
Welcome back. We're at the Biggs Museum talking about the plein air movement. Now, Ryan, we were talking about, we left off talking about Impressionists and how it really was a new sense of style,
right?
With this liberation of being able to paint outdoors. Talk to me a little bit about, you know, the types of artwork that came of this movement.
These early Impressionist painters, there was almost sort of a purist sensibility about this, in that they really felt very strongly that they needed to set up their materials outdoors and that they needed to record these climatic conditions on the landscape or on the subject in landscape that they really wanted to record, and that they would only give themselves a little bit of time to do this, because, you know, the sun sets or weather changes or the cloud distribution changes or whatever the case may be, but you're really there to sort of capture that essential beauty of nature in these very, very quick sort of moments. So a lot of plein air paintings were only a couple hours long. so that Puritanism, that puritanical sort of attitude towards this kind of painting kind of created some real gymnasts of the art world. So you start to see individuals go out there with sometimes, I mean, a lot of plein air paintings are really relatively small. Some are enormous, and there are especially some American artists associated with what we call the Bucks County Impressionists, or the Bucks County School of Impressionism. They would go out in the middle of winter with canvases that were almost 5 foot by 5 foot and just paint directly from life in the middle of snow. They became these sort of cowboy figures of the art world. It was really, it's incredible to sort of watch them.
So how would they do that? I would think that if you're out there, you know, painting and it's snowing or it's raining and they caught all of these things on canvas, that it would be challenging, you know, that it would impact your painting. I mean, did they have tents or?
So not oftentimes would they be painting directly in rain because they wouldn't want the canvas or the paints themselves to be affected, but they might be painting in severe cold. They might be in small amounts of snow that wouldn't necessarily affect those materials. And the nice thing about oil painting is that oil paints, they don't freeze very easily. So you are able to work in really kind of inhospitable circumstances.
Now, when you look at some of the paintings that are on exhibit, one done by an artist by the name of Schofield, it really is a departure from the fine, small brushstrokes that you don't see to the lines. There's not even a, I don't know, you can have fine, you can have long, they're free, just it's amazing how lush and textured his painting is.
That's a great observation. It's and it really is all about that texture. It's all about that that idea of getting this paint onto the surface as quickly as possible. But because you're moving so quickly, oftentimes those gestures, those actual sort of paint strokes, are not necessarily small, minute, detailed. They're often what they call bravura, or you create this sort of gesture, this long gesture, this one stroke across the surface. And in that stroke, you might do the entire landscape in just one or two sort of passes across the canvas. So it's really just sort of this technical achievement to be able to lay up the amount of paint onto the brush that you needed and then create these forms, these sort of basic forms onto the surface, and then just move on. You know, you're there to capture a little bit at a quick pace and then move on, and really not get too steeped into the details.
So tell me a little bit about the Delaware River in winter that Schofield did.
So that is one of those examples of him being sort of a cowboy. You know, I use that term euphemistically, but he is braving the elements, and it was part of what people were purchasing from him, was this notion that he was out in nature in winter and capturing the river with the snow sort of piling up on the edges of the river. That scene is really just sort of the end of winter, just as we're about to hit spring, but there were ice chunks floating down the river, and it was cold. It was probably you know, easily within the 20s or 30s degrees. Not exactly what you sort of picture, or when you close your eyes and you think of a painter suffering in a studio someplace. It's not him by the edge of this major waterway freezing to death while he's with these long brushes and enormous paints and giant canvases. And it's it created this image of the artist that was something very different than what people had encountered before.
I read somewhere that someone said he was able to capture the spiritual side of a landscape with his artwork.
That idea, that sort of transcendentalist idea about the land and people's relationship to land and nature, and it being sort of a stand-in or a representation of God. That was a tradition that really started out in the 1800s, the later 1800s in America, but it was very, very much in play in people's interpretations of great landscape paintings of the early 20th century too. So this idea that you might be able to somehow glimpse or experience the divine through painting and through depictions of the landscape was something in the back of people's minds for sure.
Well, I can imagine being out there if it's cold or just in a beautiful place, and being there for the first time, doing something that's revolutionary for the time in many different ways, really had to have an impact on the artist and the impression of everyone who saw the painting, because it's so different from, you know, 10, 20, 30 years before.
Definitely true. And you know, one of the things that we love here at museums is that moment where you can find where any person can walk in and be so impressed with the technique of something, the actual physical work and the mindset to put together this artwork, and at the same time the subject is so impressive and so beautiful. When you can get that combination of artist technique as well as just really good subject matter, it's magic.
Excellent. We're going to be right back and talk more about the plein air movement.
I'm Bruce Lambrecht, and I'm president of the Delaware Aviation Hall of Fame, and I love to fly with the 302.
Welcome back. We're at the Biggs Museum of American Art, and we're talking about the plein air movement with Ryan Grover. Ryan, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. You know, you walk through the gallery and the paintings are gorgeous. This movement is something, you know, it's revolutionary for its time, but it's still beautiful and impactful and inspirational to a lot of people when they look at it.
I hope so.
So when we talk about the artist, we just talked about Schofield, and there's another artist we wanted to talk about, Isaac L. Williams.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of artist he was and how he's different from in style and from Schofield?
Oh, for sure. You know, one of the big challenges of this exhibition was the idea that we had to be able to display these early plein air painters like Isaac Williams, and we also had to have in this show these later Impressionist painters, especially really dramatic Impressionist painters like Schofield, all in the same exhibition. But if you put them right next to each other, they look really discordant. It's just really, really difficult. So we had to arrange it so that some of these early plein air painters are early in the show and in a totally different gallery, even different lighting, and then brighter lights and bigger environments for the Impressionist painters that really sort of demand all this dramatic sort of presence. But Isaac Williams was, he was a Philadelphia painter from the early 1800s, and his dad had a farm just outside of Middletown, Delaware. It was kind of a fashion at the time to be sort of a gentleman farmer, so he was probably a tenant farmer as far as we know, but he would spend weekends and summers there, and Isaac Williams was responsible for some of the earliest known paintings of the landscape outside of Newcastle County, but of Delaware.
So when you look at some of his work, it's so detailed, it's so specific, it's almost like, you know, a picture, I mean, a photograph, it's that detailed. Was it the same process that, you know, perhaps an artist like Schofield used, where it was done in a matter of hours, or is this where he would take the painting out over several days and just put more effort into it or more time with it?
Yeah, Schofield was definitely a purist in terms of that plein air process, where he wanted to create entire works of art in maybe a 2-3 hour period of time in front of the scene that he wanted to depict out there in nature. Isaac Williams was not that purist. He, and what we display here in the museum is that we have this great collection of it, so you really have to see it. It's a really fun sort of study. We have smaller plein air watercolors that he created. So just simple images that he would create maybe in an hour and 15 minutes, just depicting sort of the slope of the land, the colors and fall, the way that the light is hitting these subjects. And he had many of those, and most of them were of sort of Delaware scenes, probably in and around the Middletown area. Then he also did sort of a step up from that. So a work that probably started as a plein air study, but then might have been finished within the studio. And that has his original sort of composition, but then a lot of extra detail placed into it. He was a master at the watercolor medium, and so he was able to use sort of broader brushes to kind of create these fantastic gestures, but then also these small brushes that would allow really, really intricate detail. We have some of those examples, but then he was also an oil painter. So he would take his studies, these sort of small elementary kinds of studies, and he would consider them and he would think about them, and he would allow them to inform him in larger sort of fantasies about giant oil paintings. And we have one great example here, actually probably the best known example by the artist, and it's almost 4 feet wide, and it really sort of, it brings in all of those things that he studied in plein air, but then also adds to it all of this detail that he was really only able to achieve in oil.
Now, are you referring to autumn landscapes?
Exactly right. Yeah.
So he goes out and he does a watercolor of, this beautiful pasture, and there's a couple of cows, and it's really gorgeous by itself. And then he takes that watercolor, that study, into the studio, and then elaborates and makes it more detailed. And
exactly.
So the two worlds kind of meld together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about, where this movement has gone since then.
Oh, interesting. So from sketches, so plein air sketches that would inform larger works like what we saw with Isaac Williams, into Impressionism, eventually into Impressionism. There were some steps along the way, and we talk about that here in the exhibition as well. But then when you get to Impressionism, this interest in color, this interest in artist gesture, so actually leaving your signature handprint, basically, the way that you would create that brushstroke across the surface. Those ways, those sort of elemental considerations for artwork, those become subjects within their own artwork, and so artists then sort of specialize in the modern period just in gesture or just in color, and they really sort of emphasize these tiny little details into entire compositions within their own work. And so here at the museum we show later plein air work, so these are artists that still in the later 20th century go out and study directly from nature, create original artworks from them. But then we also started a whole different exhibition that just talks about modernism and talks about the ways that people have created, sort of simplify certain subjects within artwork to really create new types of artwork entirely.
So if someone wants to come and check out the exhibit, how do they do that?
Best to try and make a reservation, excuse me, I was thinking of the word. Best to get online or to call and make a reservation here at the museum. We do have timed tickets during COVID. We are able to accommodate some walk-ins, but it's probably best to just try and get a hold of us and get your own time slot. But then the museum itself is pretty much set up on a path, so you have this great sort of space around you, and you won't necessarily have to overlap with other parties.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for spending time with us. Really fascinating.
I'm glad you came.
We'll be right back. For more information on the plein air movement, you can go to bigsmuseum.org. That'll do it for this episode of the 302. We leave you now with a beauty shot of the St. Jones River. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. We'll see you on the 302.